Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are around the world. My name is Kabe Gilampo, and I'm the Vice President for International Strategies at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, which is now fully operational. And with the first biennial transparency report submitted at the end of 2024, these are the reports that all countries have to submit every 2 years under the Paris Agreement. With those submitted, parties can now participate in the Facilitative Multilateral Consideration of Progress, or FMCP. The FMCP represents an opportunity for parties to present on their progress towards meeting their nationally determined contributions, as well as climate finance efforts under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. And while this may be seen as though it's a technical process, it actually has a very important opportunity to raise important political issues under the Paris Agreement, and importantly, to demonstrate momentum towards achieving its goals. And that's what we really want to talk about here, to raise the profile and to highlight the opportunities. So far, we've had 3 countries undergoing the FMCP process, but we're going to have all 196 parties of the Paris Agreement undergo that process every 2 years. So it's really looking ahead to that and making the most of that opportunity. And we have a really fantastic panel that I'll introduce shortly to talk about that topic. Before we dive in, a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, we are recording this event, and the recording will be available on the C2S YouTube channel afterwards. And secondly, we also should have the question and answer function enabled at the bottom of your Zoom panel. So if you have questions for the panel, and if we have time, we will come to those. So please do type your questions and comments into the Q&A function, and we'll try to come to those if we can. So with that, let's dive in. It's my pleasure to firstly welcome Xuehong Wang, who's Director of Transparency at the UNFCCC Secretariat. And of course, the UNFCCC has the enormous task of logistically trying to manage these FMCP sessions, but they went off very well in Bonn for the first time in earlier this year. So Xuehong, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this new phase of the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. How will the biennial transparency reports and the FMCP impact the Paris Agreement as we shift towards implementation? Over to you, Xuehong.
Thank you, Kava. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues. It's really very nice to meet you all. And first of all, I would like to thank C2ES for organizing this very important meeting. It's a great pleasure to be here sharing the perspective of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So I would like to, first of all, start off by congratulating all parties who have successfully submitted their first biennial transparency reports, or the BTRs, and those who are in the process of developing and finalizing their BTRs. Submitting a BTR represents a significant commitment to turn the Paris Agreement from words into action. It is also a vital step forward in delivering a real, transparent, and accountable climate process. So BTRs, so what are the BTRs? BTRs basically provide a standardized and comparable data covering the full spectrum of the Paris Agreement implementation, including GHG emissions, tracking progress in implementing and achieving NDCs, climate impacts and adaptation, and support provided and received. So BTRs in that sense provides critical information to inform the progress of Paris Agreement implementation. Now the FMCP. The FMCP process transforms these reports into a dynamic process of multilateral dialogue, enabling parties to showcase their progress and achievements, exchange best practices and lessons learned, identify areas of improvements, and for developing country parties, help them identify capacity building needs. So our early experience clearly shows that the enhanced transparency framework is more than just a reporting framework. It's a tool for parties for better policy making, smarter investments, and greater ambition. It helps countries take stock of their progress, understand their pathways, and shape responses that align with their national priorities and long-term goals.
Thanks, Shuhong. I mean, for those who are joining us who are not so familiar, so the Enhanced Transparency Framework is the part of the Paris Agreement that encourages and compels parties to report on how they're doing against their commitments under the Paris Agreement. And of course, there's flexibilities in there for developing countries as they get up to speed with reporting, and particularly also for the LDCs and small islands. Could you say a little bit more about how the FMCP was structured in Bonn? Because not everybody was in the SB session in Bonn earlier this year. So what did it actually look like on the ground for parties?
Yeah. So the FMCP process is a formal process under the auspices of the SBI. It is open to all parties and observers. As its name indicates, the process is facilitative in nature. It's a core component of the enhanced transparency framework and offers parties a unique opportunity to engage in an inclusive, constructive, and forward-looking dialogue. So there are two phases associated with this FMCP process. And then FMCP process actually builds on the experience of the multilateral assessment process and facilitative sharing of views process under the convention, if you are familiar with these two existing processes. So on the FMCP, the first phase is a written questions and answers phase between the party undergoing the FMCP process and all the other parties who can ask the party questions on their NDC implementation and climate finance and efforts under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, as Kava mentioned at the start. So the party going through FMCP will provide clarifications and updates to respond to these questions. And parties may wish to use this first phase to help address all the technical questions. The second phase then with FMCP is a multilateral dialogue during the SBI sessions. During this phase, parties engage in interactive discussions, exchange experience and best practices, identify barriers and challenges, as well as further capacity building needs. The dialogue also serves as a bridge between identified needs and potential support opportunities, helping to channel resources to where they are most needed. So if implemented effectively, the FMCP process can indeed help transform transparency into collaboration and strengthen our collective efforts to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Thanks, Shuhong. And you mentioned implementation. Of course, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the climate regime needing to move from the negotiation to implementation. And of course, the transparency regime, the enhanced transparency framework, is a key part of this implementation, as you've highlighted. Just a quick follow-up question. So how do you think that the first FMCP went in Bonn? I mean, we'll hear from one of the parties that presented for the first time. But how do you think it went? What went well, and what do you think could be improved as we undergo more parties undertaking this in Berlin in just over a month?
Thank you for the question. So the first FMCP session in Bonn earlier this year was a strong and encouraging start. We had three parties going through this process. As Kava mentioned earlier, we had Andorra, Guyana, and Panama. And then, so the three parties participated and they received a substantial number of questions during the first phase that I mentioned just now, the written questions and answers phase. So this demonstrates a genuine interest and engagement. Although it's worth noting that the questions actually came from a relatively small group of parties. So actually there were only 8 parties raising questions. So going forward, we see a broader participation in this phase would be essential to fully realize FMCP's potential for mutual learning and global cooperation. And during the first FMCP session, Secretariat was able to test and refine the design of the FMCP process, not design in such, because the procedures are very clearly defined in the MPGs, modalities, procedures, and guidelines. Basically, we're just testing the best way to operationalize FMCP. So for better time management, we tested a combined question and answer discussion round during the SBI, during the in-person session. And then it worked well and fostered a coherent dialogue. So these 3 parties actually went through a combined questions and answers discussion round. However, the limited time available for discussion also highlighted a key challenge going forward. And, in particular, we have more than 190 parties going through this process every 2 years. So how to manage time is a very real challenge going forward. And also in June, we also tested an informal dialogue after the formal working group session, and that worked very well too. So it is more informal and more engagement between the 3 parties and all the interested parties. So that worked very well. But then, however, at the same time, some parties also voiced concerns that, about navigating time constraints, as mentioned earlier. In particular, during the session, there were overlapping agenda items, with negotiations, and then the practical challenges of engaging in close dialogues formats when operating with a large specialized teams responsible for responding to diverse technical questions. And also, I think it's important to highlight that 3 parties going through the FMCP in June, they expressed strong appreciation for the FMCP process. They emphasized the value it added to their national reporting and the pride they felt in leading this transparency effort. I'm sure that Ambassador from Andorra will share more in her intervention. And then the last thing is Secretariat will further test and explore with parties the evolving design of FMCP going forward to refine the formats, enhancing accessibility, and ensuring the process continues to meet the diverse needs and capabilities of all participants.
Many thanks, Shuhong. You mentioned questions and answers. Just a reminder to participants that if you have any questions, please use the function at the bottom of the Zoom chat and we'll pose that to the panel. I think one of the key points I took from what you said, Shuhong, is that it strikes me that the transparency framework was one of the hardest negotiated parts of the Paris Agreement. So it's a little bit disappointing that only 8 parties were posing questions this time around. So I think a key learning here is to remind all those that worked so hard to establish the ETF to actually engage in it going forwards. And we'll hear a little bit more, as I said, about how that process went when we get to Ambassador Suke a little bit later. So I'd like to now turn to Richemond Assie. Richemond is the Senior Technical Advisor and Transparency Expert at the United Nations Development Programme's Climate Promise. I'm a big fan of the Climate Promise, which, if you don't know, does really fantastic work in supporting developing countries in developing their NDCs. I think is active in, I think, over 120 countries. And now is actually the UN's Climate Promise, because the Secretary General elevated the Climate Promise to be the main vehicle to support countries through the UN system for their NDCs. So Richemond, thank you so much for joining us. I'm just wondering, could you give our audience some background as to the resources available to parties in their preparation of their transparency reports? As we heard from Shuhong, all 196 or so parties will have to undergo the process of the ETF. I understand that the UNDP and Jeff are able to assist in some ways, but what is that assistance that's available? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Depending on where you are now. And thank you again, Kaveh and colleagues from C2ES for the invitation to UNDP to contribute to this very important, interesting webinar. When we are talking about the preparation of transparency reports, it's important to remember that parties are not working in isolation. There are resources available to support them. For example, UNDP provides technical assistance through its Climate Promise, which is the world's largest offer on NDCs for developing countries. And of course, this includes training, peer-to-peer exchanges, and strengthening institutional arrangement for data collections and also reporting. So on the financial side, the Global Environment Facility supports countries through the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, what we call usually CBIT. And these funds are used to improve greenhouse gas inventories, strengthen data systems, and build the skills needed to track progress toward NDCs. And UNDP is also an accredited agency for UNDP working closely with countries. So in short, while UNDP helps build the technical and institutional capacity, the GEF provides the financial backbone. This is useful for countries on this way. So together with other GEF agencies, they are enabling parties to gradually build the systems needed to meet the Paris Agreement transparency requirement. And I believe the FMCP is the best exercise for parties to auto-check themselves during their transparency journey and share the progress they made with other parties. So on this way, UNDP is like still providing technical resources assistance to countries to prepare also their MCMCPs, so they're not alone on this journey and they're not alone during this trip on transparency.
Thank you so much for that, Richemond. I think it's great to hear that there are resources available, and I would urge the participants on the call to have a look at the UNDP website and the Climate Promise website for those resources. I'm just wondering, in your view, Richemond, what more could be done to strengthen the bond between ambition, NDC target setting, and actual implementation as delivered through the transparency reports? I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that how do you see the link between the work that you're doing and the transparency regime and the FMCP process?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. Yeah. Okay, so in UNDP's view, strengthening the bond between ambition, NDC target setting, and actual implementation requires moving beyond seeing transparency report as compliance tool. It's not only that. Transparency reports should not only track emissions, but also serve as a mirror for government, showing what is working, where gaps exist, and how ambition can be raised in future NDCs. So they should instead serve as a development roadmaps that link ambition to real economy transformation. This is precisely where the UNDP's Climate Promise comes in. You see, the Climate Promise supports countries in designing NDCs that are both ambitious, realistic, and trackable, while also helping them put in place the systems and capacities needed to implement and monitor progress. So by aligning the technical support on transparency with the political process of setting and revising NDCs, we ensure that ambition is backed up with by credible action on the ground. On our recent Breakthrough for Future framework that is now starting to the implementation, identifies 4 areas that can accelerate this bond between ambition, NDC target setting, and actual implementation. The first one is governance and policy coherence. This is embedding a climate target directly into national planning and budgeting. So ambition is not abstract, but institutionalized, really. The second one is, the second area is the finance and investment strategies. This is translating NDCs into concrete investment plans that mobilize both domestic and international finance. The third one is integrated solutions across sectors. Yes, this third one. And ensuring NDC targets deliver to co-benefits in health, energy, agriculture, and resilience. And the last area that we see as very important in terms of bridging bridge a gap, a bond between the points are to strengthening social contract in terms of so that ambition is inclusive, fair, and built broad ownership. So transparency reports then become more than a retrospective look. They're not only looking back. They provide the evidence base to guide investment, track progress, and build trust. This links directly to UNDP's climate promise, which is supporting nearly around 140 countries, developing countries, to design ambitious NDCs and now increasingly implement them. So by combining the promise with the breakthrough framework, we aim to ensure that ambition is not only raised, but backed by a governance, finance, social foundations needed to turn pledges into results. So in short, transparency shows where countries are. The climate promise, the UNDP climate promise, now UN climate promise, helps them chart where they want to go, and the breakthrough approach ensure they have the means to get there. This is the way.
Richemond.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Richemond. A very quick follow-up question, because we've had a question through our Q&A function, and this question is from Nada Mohammed. So the question is, to what extent do countries tap into the resources that you're talking about? And what do you think there's any barriers that dissuade parties from seeking assistance? So are you finding that countries are reaching out and asking you for assistance in these areas?
Yes, of course. We are here to help countries and support this exercise. So first of all, the resources are available to all countries that are developing countries, particularly, not developed, so developing countries can access easily these resources. We are here to support them because most of them have has some key barriers in terms of assessing these results, prepare the initial steps, and have like a clear mapping of needs they have in the countries before moving forward and prepare some products and project information identification form to help starting the process. So we are here to help on every stages of this process, and we can reach out to people can reach out to our country offices to try to start the process and get everything to overcome the challenges and barriers they are facing.
Thanks, Richemond. So I think the point there is reach out to the UNDP country offices if you need assistance with this process. So thank you very much for that. I mean, we've talked a lot about the sort of how the FMCP is set up and some of the resources to participate. I'd now like to turn to a country that has undergone the process. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to introduce Ambassador Noelia Souquet, who's the Ambassador for Cross-Border Cooperation for Andorra, which is a country that is very close to my heart. So it's really wonderful to have Andorra represented on this meeting. And of course, the reason why that is that Andorra was one of the first countries to undergo the FMCP process. But historically, under the Paris Agreement, Andorra has consistently been one of the first countries to submit new NDCs. It was one of the first 3 countries, I think, to have a net zero commitment. one of the first countries, if not the first, to submit its biennial transparency report. So Andorra has definitely earned its place on this call. So Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. So as we say, as I said, Andorra was one of the first to submit both its BTR and one of the first 3 to undergo the FMCP. I think actually it was the first, if I'm not mistaken. So what was it like to prepare for and present on your transparency report in Bonn? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. So good morning all, good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions for having me today and being part of such a distinguished panel of experts. We're very proud. Andorra, so you get the context, is a very small country in the Pyrenees, approximately 468 kilometers square and 90,000 inhabitants. Just that you understand, we welcome up to 10 million tourists a year, which is also a big part of our reality today. Andorra, so that you know as well, is responsible for less than 0.001% of global emissions. But it's, of course, a tiny contribution to the global problem. But it doesn't mean that because this share of emissions is small, that climate change is not really affecting directly our small, beautiful mountain country. So we note that since the 50s, the temperature is rising by 3 degrees in the Pyrenees, which is really directly impacting on the amount of snow that we're getting in winter, reducing also, needing some more policy strategy for adaptation, of course, mitigation. And those policies are really at the core of the Andorran political agenda right now. So as you mentioned, Kaveh, Andorra is working hard to actually reverse climate change. We have been committing to our NDCs to reduce our emissions by 65% by 2035 compared to 25, and reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. So like this, you have the context. Andorra has some experience, I would say, in international review. We've undergone 4 complete international consultation and analysis cycles since 2014. And we really been learning, I would say, along those cycles. Today, we are more committed than ever, I would say. And I think that you mentioned that, but I really can proudly say that we became a climate champion. A climate champion simply because, first of all, Andorra, as you mentioned, was the first country to submit its first BTR, and we're very proud of that, in October 23, 1 year ahead of the UNFCCC deadline. Dr. Wang, I think this is quite an achievement as well, considering time constraints. Then, secondly, we've been the first also country to get through the technical expert review in country here in Andorra, in May 2024, less than a year after submitting the first BTR. And finally, together, as you mentioned, Dr. Wang, with Guyana and Panama, Andorra has been among the first countries to officially complete the full cycle review under the ETF transparency framework, having the FMCP meeting back in Bonn in last June. So what does it mean, Kaveh? To me, it means that size does not matter when it comes to commitment and transparency.
Thank you so much. I was present when Andorra made the presentation in Bonn, and what I was really struck by, well, first of all, I thought the presentation was really excellent, but I was also really struck by the fact that it was a very nice atmosphere in the FMCP, and it wasn't confrontational. So I think if countries are worried about the process, the experience that I saw from the FMCP in Bonn was that the ones asking questions were genuinely interested. And there were also many sort of conversations that happened after the formal presentation that were really useful. But I mean, from Andorra's perspective, what was it like to sort of do the actual presentation? And did Andorra find the whole process useful? And if it was useful, how was it useful for Andorra?
Yes, of course. So before maybe getting into the details of the process on the session itself, I just wanted to make a note to let you know that our Andaman Energy and Climate Change Agency, which I'm actually very proud of because they do a wonderful job, has only one director, 4 technicians, and 4 sectoral experts. So you imagine the resources constraint we have. So about the FMCP as such, I think that what we can share with you is that we found that process quite intense, and we were obviously under time constraints, but very constructive as well. It took place, as you mentioned, in the FBI meeting in Bonn back in June this year. And we've noticed that although Dr. Wang mentioned that only 8, I would say, peers did share questions, we noticed that during the session, like there was kind of an important interest of the 30, almost 30 countries that were present around the table. So that was really something we noticed. We received, as you mentioned, some 17 questions ahead of the session, so some 3 months ahead by these 7, 8 countries. And we had a month more or less also to respond. So that was also quite challenging for the team. As I said, we have little resources. But I think that what we really noticed is that the difference with, for instance, the technical expert review was that within the discussions, we noticed that the questions were going towards policy making rather than technical aspects, which to us were quite useful also because we were discussing mitigation strategy, adaptation strategy, and we also discussed about entity tracking, which is very important, indicators, rather than only looking at emission inventories, for instance. So we believe that this was really a constructive approach that allows us to exchange on best practices and share our progress on a very honest manner with the peers. And I believe that this was very constructive for all of us, and also the ones that were actually inquiring about the process. I want to emphasize that that was not punitive at all. So I think this is something that Dr. Wang also shared. We really felt it as really an ongoing co-improvement process, which I think is the way it's been created, really. You mentioned that we had during the session the opportunity also to give a short, let's say, presentation that we pre-recorded. There was also presenting actually all the, let's say, what we understood from also the recommendation of the expert review, and also built on all these elements. And then what was really the highlight to us was what you mentioned, Dr. Wang, the session that was going on after the formal session. The format was really a great format to us, such as a walk fair. And we really had good exchanges in that informal session with the peers. And I think that to us was one of the most useful.
That's really great feedback, and I heard the same thing, that the informal session afterwards was really very useful. The challenge, I think, for the UNFCCC is how would we do that for the remaining 193 parties? Because if we have to do this every 2 years for everybody, that means rather than 3 parties in Berlin, we'd need at least 50, and then 50 in Bonn next year, and then 50 at COP31. So the challenge of not losing that benefit of the informal discussion. I was also really struck by how nice the atmosphere was. And it's interesting that you were saying that people were asking questions about policy implementation. One other observation that I had was that a lot of the discussions that were happening under the FMCP are what countries had wanted to happen under the mitigation work program. So I think it's really to emphasize how useful that forum was, because it was a very safe space for those parties. I mean, as you said, you had to prepare, but it wasn't an interrogation. It was a Q&A, which was good. Just very quickly before we move on, are there any lessons that you think that you learned from the process that could be useful for other countries that are about to undergo the FMCP?
Sure. So of course we encourage the other countries to also commit to the transparency framework and do their homework. Because I think that what we've learned across that process was that transparency first really validates the credibility of all the data that we've submitted from the NDCs to the VTI to all the review process with the experts, and really gave some great credibility to all the data we provided. Second, it really strengthened our policy making and our institutions, and also the commitments we took. So I think this is really a lesson learned as well. And develop the capacities of our experts, of course, because they learn also from the other peers and from the secretariat. So I think this really was a lesson learned. And then it really enabled us to access best practices from the other peers and other solutions that we might not have thought about, and that could also serve countries, developing countries or small countries like us with little resources. What I can also say, and maybe Dr. Wang, correct me if I'm wrong, is that I think that we both learned from the process, the secretariat and the countries as well, because it was also the first time for you to go through the entire process. And I think this was really a first for all of us. So I think we all learned from that. And what I could say is that I think we demonstrated, Andorra demonstrated that even a very small, I would say, country in the middle of the Pyrenees, regardless its size, has really a vital role to play in climate change mitigation. So I think that we show that we first need to be transparent and share openly about the strengths, challenges, and everything that is going around, all the work that we entail to make sure that we comply with commitments. Secondly, we need to really engage directly with the secretariats. And I think that one of the lessons learned for us is that that needs to happen directly without intermediaries, because this is really easing up all the work that we're doing with our teams at home. And maybe the last word to me would be say to all the colleagues to keep cool and really consider this as, I would say, the start of a co-learning journey. And we're constantly improving also what we report and the policies we put in place. So for me, this is really the final word, I would say. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you so much. If I took one message from that, it's that countries will get as much out of the process as they put in, and it's really worth putting some effort in. And also, if those who are joining us, if you're not one of the 10 million a year that goes to Andorra, I would definitely encourage you to go there. So that's my part for the Andorra Tourist Board. So turning from a country that has undergone the FMC process, I'd now like to turn to one that is due to undergo the FMCP process, I understand, at COP30. So I'm very happy now to introduce Sandra Boitumelo Motshwanedi. I probably made a terrible effort of your name, I apologize. Sandra is the director of UNFCCC Matters for the South African Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. So we're really grateful for you to take the time, because I suspect you're preparing for the pre-COP, the COP, and also the FMCP. So Sandra, South Africa has long been a leader in the UNFCCC transparency reporting, and many will be looking forward to South Africa's participation at the FMCP session in Belém at COP30. A couple of questions. What has South Africa's preparation for that been? And beyond box ticking and preparation for the FMCP, are there things that you're hoping to get out of the whole process at COP30? So thank you, Sandra, and over to you.
Thank you, Kaveh, and good afternoon to colleagues. I hope you can hear me. For some reason, my internet is not so good today.
We can hear you and see you perfectly.
Thank you. I'm Sandra from South Africa, and it's a pleasure to be here on this webinar panel with Her Excellency the Ambassador and the colleagues as well in the transparency space and work. So it's a pleasure, and good afternoon to all the participants. So indeed, as South Africa, we are preparing for the FMCP. We submitted our BTR last year in December. We submitted the BTR with the NID, and then we also did the CTFs for NDC tracking and for support needed and received, as well as the CRTs for our National Inventory Report. In terms of preparation for the FMCP, first of all, we also underwent the technical expert review process. As you know, it was an in-country technical expert review process because we wanted to learn as much as we can from the expert and understand on how we can improve in reporting over time. So we valued having the expert and the secretariat in our home soil in South Africa. And then we worked together with them in finalizing the technical expert review report, and hence now we are looking forward to being amongst the parties that will be undergoing the second FMCP. Now, with regards to the preparation process, I must say that the actual technical expert review process itself has already initiated us, or at least helped us with the preparation, because similar to the FMCP, there's the pre-phase wherein parties send questions through the virtual systems or the online systems. In this case, we use the multilateral assessment portal. And similar with the technical expert review process, you have the experts asking prior questions in the BUR VTR and the inventory VTR. So this has helped us because now we know that, okay, as teams, we need to first organize ourselves in terms of who is an expert and who has to answer to which question. So we have the inventory team that have organized themselves and their experts in terms of allocating roles and responsibilities, who answers which question. The same applies to the NDC tracking team, who have also organized themselves, and also including the transparency team within our section, because we also have the transparency team that coordinates the entire work. So we've learned from that. And because that has also orientated us, we will not be making use of any flexibilities. So far it looks like we will be able to respond by the deadline that's given to us, which is the 10th of this month. So this is how we are actually preparing ourselves as part of the first phase. So we have received a couple of questions on the inventory and on NDC tracking. Countries like the EU, New Zealand, Korea, the Republic of Korea, Japan, United Kingdom, and Canada. So it's mostly developed countries. We were hoping that we'd also get some for developing countries, but nonetheless, we know that developing countries, people have resource constraints and they don't have time for everything. So the first step is that we want to make sure that by the deadline, we have responded to all the questions that have been raised. And then we understand the next phase will be that then we will then need to do the video recording of our PTR. We know that the secretariat will send a template for us, and then with some guiding template there on how to do that video recording. So we look forward to doing that video recording of our PTR, which will be displayed during the FMCP when it's our turn to present our PTR. We know that also based on the previous experience, having participated in the FSV process and the MRV framework, the FSV is called facilitative sharing of views. It's very similar when you submit the BURs. We know that along with that video, there's going to be, the delivery of a national statement. So we are also preparing that ahead of time. And then we know that then during the actual day at the COP, we will then have several countries presenting their PTRs on the day. We know normally they are loaded in alphabetical order, but something that we would like to also plan ahead with the secretariat, because as you know, the process includes presenting and then the Q&A. And obviously, we would like to have our home experts to participate virtually as well in that FMCP and to be able to respond to the questions as well, so that the work of responding to the questions is not only limited to the team that will be present at that FMCP session and at the COP. So what we are also contemplating on is the understanding that, we have, I think if I'm correct, we have a 6-hour time difference with Brazil. And something that we would also like to plan with the Secretariat ahead of time is to make sure that how we are placed in the agenda also allows for participation of the expert at home, meaning that it's not too early for them or too late, but it's something that we're still going to discuss with the Secretariat when we get to the stage with the team under Shihong. And then also preparing ourselves for the actual FMCP. Having participated previously in the FSVs and then having participated also briefly in the first FMCP that took place in Bonn, we have seen how questions come in different ranges. Obviously, you have some that are very technical questions, some are policy-orientated questions, some sometimes a bit political, and some are more on lessons learned and sharing best practices. So we also have to make sure that even how we organize ourselves as a team that's ready for that FMCP, we know who can answer each question. For example, if a question is highly political, we know that we have to have, you know, the high levels, or at least the head of delegation present as well at that FMCP session that will take place in Bonn. Of course, if he's not available, we do have the deputy hosts. Yeah, so that is that. So we want to make sure that is we have prepared well in advance for those. And in terms of how beneficial it is, for me, it gives us as opportunity as parties to learn from each other. I mean, I'm looking at some of the questions. Some parties are asking about our systems, how they work, how we do our QA process, how we archive the data. So we are giving an opportunity to other parties to learn from us. And even for us, it's an opportunity for us to learn from other parties on their systems, on their transparency systems, on their policies, how their policies are structured, which policies they find effective, how they, you know, calculate the impact of those, how they calculate the impact of those policies and measures and all of that. So it gives a very, very good opportunity to learn from each other. And also as we go ahead with implementation of our policies to achieve the targets in our NDCs, to know, okay, we can improve still by learning from others. And then also the second part where it's a dialogue during the FMCP, we are also looking forward to that, sharing with others the best practices and learning from them. Thank you, Kaveh.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And you raised challenges that I hadn't even thought about, but I saw Shihong furiously taking notes. But you know, the point of that not all delegations can bring all of their experts with them, and so the importance of having the online participation, and then of course the challenges that brings with time zones, and of course for the Secretariat, the challenge of having, you know, several dozen parties undergoing the FMCP at one time and trying to have all of these sort of things such as virtual participation. You mentioned many opportunities at CTS. We've also done a lot of thinking around this, and maybe my team can share some of the latest thinking in our papers in the chat. You mentioned, Sandra, that there's this combination of the political level and the technical, and it's probably going to be your HOD that presents the political part, if available. Marcela, who's a great friend of ours and of the process. One of the things we are asking at CTUS is if whether that political aspect could even be elevated to the ministerial level. So could we get to the stage where even ministers were presenting the political aspects at the FMCP, because I think that would then really draw a lot of attention, and that's maybe something Shihong can think about with parties, whether there might be a way of structuring the presentations where ministers could at least come and give the overarching political aspect and then hand over to HODs and technical experts. That's not something I expect you to respond to now, Sandra, of course, but something to maybe think about. But thank you so much for that. Please do keep your questions coming via the Q&A function. We have a few here that I will turn to at the end, but I'd like to now turn to Dr. Ben Abraham, who is last but certainly not least. Ben is a senior consultant at the Instituto Talanoa, which is a climate policy think tank based in Brazil. and he was previously the senior advisor at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So Ben, thank you for joining us. I wanted to ask you sort of, well, President Lula has called Belém the COP of truth, and in other fora we've heard repeatedly that Brazil wants to prioritize implementation of COP30, and our previous speakers from Xiong onwards have really highlighted the intersection between the transparency regime and implementation. So how can transparency mechanisms such as the FMCP help to shift the narrative in the UNFCCC process to focus on action rather than just negotiations? So thanks, Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kaveh, and thanks to C2S for organising this webinar on this really important topic. It's great to add my thoughts to the conversation from a civil society perspective, but also having recently been part of the negotiations myself. And I guess when I sort of tackle this question around, what is the shift in narrative towards climate action, towards implementation, I guess I really start to think about that question by imagining the future. Like, what do we think we want COPs and this process to look like in the future? And I think, for me, and I think for many others I've talked to, we sort of see that maybe the process should evolve to one where there is more focus on action implementation. And there's always going to be the need for treaty compliance and renewal negotiations, but perhaps overall the balance of focus and time should shift to have more time spent on sharing experiences and ideas to accelerate implementation, like some of these questions we've just heard from Sandra, for example, speaking about, and from Andora's experience, holding each other to account for our commitments, and of course, all in a spirit of solidarity. And really, that's what the FMCP does. And at the moment, there's a lot of discussions happening around, reform to the COP process. How can we change things in the process to make things focus more on implementation and trying to come up with big ideas on this? But I think, as we think about that idea, we should really start by looking at the tools we already have. And, transparency is the mechanism for inducing implementation in the design of the Paris Agreement, for compliance, for holding people to account, both internationally and also creating the hooks for domestic stakeholders to push for implementations within each country. So when we're talking about the shift towards implementation, the first port of call should really be, are we pulling fully the levers that we already have? And with the FMCP only really just beginning, and we're in our first round of BTRs just done last year, we still haven't fully pulled that lever. And I think the FMPC is now a really great opportunity to do that. And while there is a challenge of I think a bit of a mindset shift. I think you mentioned how intense the transparency negotiations had been some years back when this was negotiated. And maybe now it's been a little quieter on that front. It's really, a time for a mindset shift to bring this process back to the fore and seen it as critical to this process. But one advantage I think that we have now with the FMCP compared to, say, the facilitative sharing of views or the multilateral assessment under the transparency mechanism for the convention is that there's just a lot more kind of political thrust and direction, I think, to the FMCP, which is really interesting, that I think everyone should be paying attention to. And one is obviously the focus on NDCs, where we have now these targets, we have these NDCs in the context of the goals of the Paris Agreement around limiting warming below 2 degrees, striving for 1.5 degrees, as well as having a focus on Article 9, climate finance, which wasn't part of the multilateral assessment before. And we know how critical climate finance discussions are at the moment. So there's just some really politically relevant and important elements that are going to come into this process that perhaps we didn't have before. And I think once we begin to wake up to that and see how important this can be, there's a real opportunity for the FMCP to hold a much stronger and more significant place in our process moving forward. And hopefully COP30 is a chance to take steps in that direction.
Thanks, Ben. Just a quick follow-up. So, I mean, you represent, well, you're working with a civil society organization based in Brazil. I'm just wondering, are there ways, do you think, that the civil society could play a larger role in the process? So, Xiong mentioned at the top of the webinar that the sort of the structure of the FMCP or its mandate has been negotiated, and we're operating within that. And my understanding is that during the actual FMCP process, it's only parties that can ask questions in the room. If I'm wrong, Shuhong, then shake your head, but I think I'm right. So obviously civil society has an important role to play, but there were reasons, I think, why the FMCP was designed that way, particularly to give parties comfort of how the meeting would be conducted. So if there's any countries that are worried about the FMCP, one of the modalities is that only other parties can ask questions. But given that Brazil is emphasizing so much on civil society participation, do you think there's ways that civil society could engage a little bit more with this? And we've also had a related question in the chat. So of how could non-party stakeholders active in the climate action agenda, for example, support the FMCP process? So maybe Ben, if you could touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first part of the process is also just really ensuring that there is a space. You kind of, mentioned that, there was just a small number of parties that went in Bonn. And in the future, we may be talking about 15, 20 countries going at each stage, SSBs at COP and in Bonn, and really needing to do justice to that and create the space and the time. And that can feel hard when there's, so many other things on the agenda at the moment. It feels tight. But I think it's really should be seen as part of the natural evolution of the process, that there will be sufficient space and time given to this into the future. And having that time and space will then also flow into the opportunities for civil society to engage. And even if civil society can't ask questions directly now, I think there's still a massive role for them to play. Just like in the negotiations themselves, the civil society is not directly negotiating, but they play an enormous role. Amplifying the political messages that are coming out, challenging them, talking to them inside events, engaging with party reps on the margins before and after as well to help shape the process, floating ideas for questions that parties might want to ask. All of that kind of role which civil society traditionally plays to the negotiations, I think can fit into the FMCP process as well. And I think the other critical part is just that link that civil society plays to implementation at the domestic level, because the Paris Agreement is designed to facilitate action at the national level, nationally determined actions. And with the countries participating in the FMCP at the international level, it's the civil society that can play that great link back to the domestic context to make sure that what is said and what's going on is connected back, and the transparency and the data that comes out through the BTRs and the FMCP can be brought back to the domestic level and be used by domestic stakeholders to build the politics, to work on the policy and help drive that implementation at the domestic level. So I think there's a lot to do both there on the ground at COP, at the negotiations, but also being that link to the domestic level, which is really where the implementation happens. And who knows, maybe in the future, 2028, there's negotiations on the MPGs, on the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency process. And if civil society proves itself to be an effective interlocutor now in these early years of the FMCP, there could be every possibility of opening up more spaces for them to engage formally in the future as well.
Thank you, Ben. And I also do wonder whether civil society, and particularly civil society in Brazil, has a role to play in pressing the incoming COP presidency to really elevate the profile of the FMCP process in Belém. As I said, at CTS, we're sort of asking whether having the initial presentations done at the political level might be an important way to do this. So with that, we have 15 minutes left, and I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. If people in the audience do have questions that they would like answered, this is your time to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to miss out on them. I'm going to, I have a question here posed by Elizabeth. Well, I have two questions I'm going to raise. One is, how can the FMCP presentations be turned into opportunities for investment and partnership rather than just compliance? And I'm going to give some time, but Noelia, I wonder whether that's something in your role as ambassador for cross-border cooperation you might want to think about. I'll come back to you in a second if you want to answer that one. It's this question about whether the FMCP process might open up opportunities for investment. But more immediately, we have a question here from Elizabeth, who makes the point that Andorra has presented, but is representing only 0.0001% of annual GHG output. And I've got a question here for Xu Hong. I mean, the question is, when will the countries that are responsible for a greater proportion of GHG emissions present? So particularly countries of the G20. So of course we have South Africa presenting shortly. My understanding, Xu Hong, is that all countries will have to present every 2 years. So maybe you can take that question, Xu Hong.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Indeed, as mentioned earlier during this session, so each party will submit BTR every 2 years. Of course, LDCs and Cs is at their discretion submitting a BTR. But all the other parties are, submitting every 2 years, and then these reports will be reviewed by an international team of review experts, and then the following the reviews, it will be FMCP. So all the parties will go through the FMCP at some stage, as you rightly put it, Kava. So for the bigger, at COP30 in Belém, EU and South Africa, these are the two big economies. Among the other economies will go through FMCP. China and India. China's review has been done very recently, half a month ago. So the technical expert review of China's BTR has been done, and then we expect the FMCP will be either next June or at COP31. Similarly, with the other big economies, some of them we are still waiting for the BTR, but at some point everyone will go through this process, where we will. FMCP will present the opportunity to share this information, and all the parties have a chance to raise questions, have an honest conversation there. So
thanks, Sean. Just a couple of really quick follow-ups. Is there a process as to how the order of countries is chosen? Is one question that we've had, and the other question I had is, I think Ben said that we're going to have to move to having 20 or so countries presenting. If we're going to do it every 2 years, we're going to have 50 or so countries presenting every session. So have you sort of given more thought as to how that extraordinary logistical challenge is going to be overcome? Because for me, it seems there's a real tension between getting through all the presentations, but not losing a lot of the benefits that Ambassador Suke mentioned, that, for example, Andorra experienced, and Sandra mentioned about these sort of informal exchanges afterwards. So how do you choose the order, and how are you going to get through almost 200 countries every 2 years?
Okay, so far what we are doing is, for those parties who submitted a BTR and then have gone through a BTR review, then these parties will be prioritized for FMCP. So far we are managing that, because so far we are still in the process, the first round of the Enhanced Transparency Framework cycle. But then going forward, indeed, that will pose challenges. Just now Kava gave a quick calculation. It's around 50 parties, right, going through each session, going through each SBI session, and then so that we can complete 190 parties in every 2 years. There are different ways. Secretariat indeed has been working with some parties to already flesh out what could be the possible ways forward. The MPGs allows for webinars, for instance, and then also we're trying to consider the format during the FMCP session under SBI, how we can combine questions and answers. We're already testing some, but indeed. And then we will need to work further on that to really identify ways to make best use of the opportunities.
Thank you so much. One thought that came into my head as you were speaking, I'm aware, for example, that Andorra is a member of the Mountain Partnership group of countries. Whether or not there's a way that the presentations could be organized thematically, for example. Maybe that's a way of having efficiencies where you would have maybe LDCs and SIDS or the mountain countries. That could be something to think about. I have Sandra who's got her hand up, and then I might come to Ambassador Suke on that question that I posed earlier. So Sandra, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Kaveh. I wanted to also respond a bit on the question of how can countries also use this as an opportunity to attract investment. I think even though for us as developing countries, we report on financial support, technology transfer and development, as well as capacity building support needed and received voluntarily, it would also be good if that is also included in our presentations in the case that you have reported on it and you wish to bring that information to the attention of all the parties and the stakeholders during the FMCP, because then your needs are out there and different stakeholders can see your needs, and then possibly there could be those in the room and those that are watching as well that may be in a position to provide that support. And even if I look at the MPG's section paragraph 190A, it also says that information that is provided in paragraph 10E is included in the scope of the FMCP, which is the support needed and received. Of course, it's voluntary for developing countries, but that may also help with attracting support. Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful, and also for reiterating that part of the mandate that is also about the Article 9 finance provisions, and I think Ben mentioned that. So Noelia, if you don't mind, I didn't prepare this with you, but do you think the FMCP can be useful for attracting investment on climate action?
Thank you so much, Kaveh. I don't need to prepare because I'm coming from finance, so more than happy to answer that one. So I would say that thank you to Sophia, first of all, for the question. I think it's a very actually relevant question. From the Andorran side, I think that the commitments we're taking, I would say, under the Paris Agreement are also actually mirrored in a number of other actions we're taking on the finance grounds. So first of all, Andorra is a country, and I think one of the few in the world, where the debt is 83% social and sustainable, meaning that we built the debt with green bonds. So that's already one way to incentivize investment, I would say, linked to the commitment we're taking on the climate front. Then we also try to embed all the climate necessities as much as possible in the budgeting process. From a public viewpoint still, but it is very important to take those aspects into consideration while we're building the budget at state level. And also, I think there's other tools, policy tools, of course, that can be serving here the purpose of also attracting investments. And one of them for us also has been the carbon tax, which is really having a double role here, because it's helping to sustain I would say the inputs that the government is getting and flowing into the budget, but it's also having this other objective also to limit the emissions. So I think those are tools that we're using in the public sector. As for the private sector, I think it's also very important to actually link them to all of these actions we're taking. And I think this is one of the things we're trying also to achieve in Andorra, to get the private sector involved as much as possible, to try to have some public-private partnerships, and also to actually build some opportunities to invest in very specific projects that would then serve actually the reduction of emissions. That can be, for instance, energy projects. We're working on energy efficiency and energy independence for a while already, trying to increase our energy independence and produce up to 30% of the energy in Andorra. We are doing this with green sources, and those are also opportunities for the private sector also to come and fund those kind of initiatives. So that would be my say. And maybe to your question also, Kaveh, on how we could actually classify the countries as for the FMCP. I think that the idea of using mountains, for instance, is a good one, but I'm also thinking that in the countries that, for instance, have important mountains, we don't have necessarily the same realities, either politically or size-wise as well. So I think that taking into account, first of all, the size of the country is very important, and then, of course, the resources. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your answer there and highlighting how the process could be useful for attracting investment. Richemond, I noticed that you typed an answer in the chat on this. Did you want to come in very briefly on this point? You're muted, Richemond.
Yes,
there
exactly.
You go. Yeah.
Yes, sure. Because as you know, the FMCP is like reviewing both parties' progress and also towards in its indices and its efforts under Article 9. This means efforts under the financial resources and everything. So this is a very good platform for countries to try to discuss investment. It's among parties, donors, investors, and everybody in terms of financial support as part of the support needed and received for the NDC's implementation. So the place is here for consultation and discussions. First of all, when preparing the FMCP, and after, when the FMCP is reported widely on how a party benefits from resources and implement everything. So it's a very good platform to discuss these things. As we are discussing support needed and received, it's a very platform to discuss investment and financial resources mobilized as well. Over.
Thank you so much, Richemond. And we've got a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to turn to Ben, just in case he had any final thoughts or reflections before we come to a close, and then I'll go to Shuhong for the last word. So, Ben.
Thanks, Kavi. Yeah, it's been a great conversation so far, and I was just sort of reflecting on some of the comments shared and what you were saying around the opportunity for Brazil, who's been talking a lot about making this an implementation COP. And at Talanoa Institute, we recently published a short blog posting was titled FMCP, One Big Idea to Make COP30 an Implementation COP. And in that, we had a few recommendations which touched on what we mentioned today. And one of it was giving the space and the time needed for this, which is obviously going to grow in the future. And I do believe that time can be found along with some of the creative ideas that we have discussed. And one of the reasons is I also think that it's possible to reduce some of the time available for negotiations. Negotiators are to agree like a gas, and they will expand to fill whatever time you give them. If you give them longer, they will go all night to use it. If you give them less, they will do the same. There is space, I think, to open it up. The second one was we were recommending that Brazil go first and use its presidency platform to elevate it, including with high-level representation. You already mentioned the possibility of bringing ministers involved. I think that's really important and a good direction to move in the long run. And Brazil was the first COP that has an FMCP happening. We had one in Bonn, but Brazil should really, I think, take the chance to profile this, even if they're not participating at this one, to bring some of their high-level representation to show support for it. And also noting that their presidency runs through until next year. So it's a good opportunity, I think, for them to go at Bonn next year and to show that actually the FMCP is a year-round process. It isn't just 2 days of transparency at COP. It's a year-round commitment to transparency and implementation. And I think they can do that by leaning into their presidency as it comes to Bonn next year. And then thirdly, just giving this some profile to say, actually, part of the story of COP30 of responding to the NDC's emphasis for sport is this idea of doubling down on implementation, and successfully hosting a high-profile, effective FMCP can be an important part, I think, of COP30's legacy going forward. So I think a lot of opportunities for Brazil, and it's been great to touch on those points here today.
Thank you, Ben. I think you may have read the CTUS papers because we completely agree. It would be fantastic to see President Lula maybe even opening the FMCP process. Let's see if we can make that happen, or at least Ambassador Delago. Shuhong, you have the last word, and then we're going to close. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Kava. I just wanted to come back quickly on the investment opportunities that we discussed earlier. I think the FMCP, the whole process of enhanced transparency framework basically can boost the confidence of investors and donors. The fact that a party, put a BTR together, sharing their data, showing their national system, it already tells a story. So I think that's the other aspect to look at this, how this process can be used by everyone to consider this as an investment opportunity for them. Then one last thing, I just wanted to come back to the earlier questions in the chat about, limited number of parties raising questions. I should have clarified that, of course, during the written questions and answers. That's one phase. But actually, as the ambassador just now mentioned, Andorra's experience and with the first round of FMCP, during the session, there are a lot of very, very good questions. Not only questions, but also, requesting parties to share their best practice and experience and how they address the challenges, because very often many countries have similar challenges. So through this interactive dialogue, parties really learn from each other. So I think a lot richer information actually comes out of the session itself. Through this in-person engagement. But thank you again for this opportunity. It's really great to hear all the very valuable inputs, from the UNFCCC Secretariat side. We really learned a lot, and that will help us to design and support parties in a more effective manner going forward. So back to you, Calvin.
Thank you, Shuhong. I mean, you made an important point. So the private sector is always saying that it wants certainty and predictability to make investment. And I think, as you say, if a country is presenting publicly on its plans, I think it gives that confidence that there's a lot of thought being given to the targets that are being put forward, and they're not just words on paper. So I think that's important. My final reflection is that, again, the transparency framework of the Paris Agreement was years in the negotiating. I mean, I think the process that led to the agreement of that was probably a 10-year process in total, going back even before Copenhagen. So it's a little bit frustrating that having done all of that work, that it hasn't yet achieved the profile that it needs to. And we're in a position now where countries and civil society is saying we need to focus on implementation, and there's questions being raised about the efficacy of the Paris Agreement. As one of the panelists said, the Paris Agreement now has all the mechanisms in place to be fully operational, and one of the key ones is the FMCP and the transparency. And I think what we've seen during this panel is some clarification of how the process works, but also the opportunity that the process presents has the potential to answer a lot of questions that people are asking of the process. So we don't need to invent something new for implementation. We already have this thing here that highlights progress. So I really hope that we lean into it and use it fully. And with that, I would really like to thank our great panel for taking the time, to Shuhong, to Richemond, to Ben, but in particular also to Ambassador Suke, and also Sandra, who's taking time out from preparing the FMCP to talk about the FMCP. So we really wish you, Sandra, all the best for the process in Berlin, and we'll be there to support you there and wish you the best for that. So thank you to everybody. Thank you for those online who joined us and for the questions, and the recording will be available on the C2S website after this. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.